Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod, and the fifth in our series looking at the implications on the future of work in partnership with Working the Future. Today, we're diving into a trend that's reshaping how talent connects with opportunity, next generation talent ecosystems. This era of on-demand work might just be the biggest shift in how we approach our careers and in hiring. So what exactly are these next generation talent ecosystems? Is it all about fluid, flexible and dynamic ways of working where skills and opportunities meet in real time? Is it where they're powered by technology? We'll uncover three key drivers propelling this trend into the future. But what might the future hold? We'll explore the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios of how these ecosystems potentially lead to greater freedom and the matching of skills to needs, or the pessimistic ones where challenges like job security and inequality might deepen. And lastly, we'll wrap up with actionable insights on what organizations can start doing today to harness the power of evolving talent ecosystems. Once again, I'm delighted to be able to welcome founding co-director of Working the Future, Cathryn Banard, to this collaborative series of podcasts. Cat, welcome back.
Thanks, Steve.
Can we start with this? I've mentioned the term next generation talent ecosystems, and you talk about that a lot in your report. What do you mean? What is a next generation talent ecosystem?
So I think loosely speaking, I think I would define a talent ecosystem as the market, the contextually appropriate market for your organization that comprises all the different ways in which you can access talent to fulfill work tasks that deliver value for your organization. So thinking beyond permanent employment, thinking beyond very traditional employment types, to look at the full array, the full spectrum of employment types that exist in the market today to allow work to get done.
And does that factor in, do you think, the sort of changing nature of the relative power that perhaps a recruiter has over a candidate? Because, you know, we've seen how in the past, perhaps all the power's been with the organization looking to recruit talent. But is that shifting? Is the talent shifting towards the candidate?
I think the balance of power is shifting, and I think that there are a number of reasons for that. One is that um, the population is slowly shrinking and aging in parallel, which means that over time our labour markets are contracting, they're reducing in size. Which unfortunately means from an employer's perspective that there is a shrinking pond in which to fish. And it does mean that organisations need to look beyond the confines of conventional employment types to be able to access people and their talents in a way that works and is equitable for everybody. So in 2021, I think it was, Deloitte, in partnership with Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sloan Management Review, produced an initial report that talked about next generation talent ecosystems. And they, I think in that research, had found through their own research that 87% of businesses surveyed had recognised a dependency on the alternative workforce to get work done. What was interesting at that point in time was that of that 87%, a good proportion also conceded that they lacked any viable engagement strategy for anybody that was working for the business yet sat off payroll.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How the kind of the what's become normal for work has become much more complex than perhaps it was in the past. The other thing that strikes me, I mean, I guess the sort of the ecosystem that sits around talent has also shifted. You know, if we go back into the past, I guess it was predominantly local and it became national, but now it's global, isn't it? I mean, what's to stop even small enterprises recruiting people from the other side of the world, because the technology allows us to do that, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a failing, in my view, of organizational ethics in recent years that far too much focus has skewed towards cost per hire in recruitment, such that today, rather than think about the role an organization has to play in local community sustainability, there is unfortunately a preoccupation with finding people to fulfill job tasks at the lowest price possible, which has in turn given rise to the gig economy platforms like Upwork and TaskRabbit and Fiverr, where if you want something done, you can scope out what it is that you want done, chuck it onto a gig platform and wait for your lowest possible bids to roll in. And because anybody with access to the internet anywhere in the world can position themselves as a producer of that ilk, you find that certain skill sets, say graphic design, for instance, graphic designers in Sussex are now competing with graphic designers in Sri Lanka. And of course, there's going to be a massive price differential because the cost of living is so very different between those two locations.
We've already covered quite a bit of ground there. So, and I guess when we start to think about what three of the key drivers might be around evolving talent ecosystems, I guess we started to touch on some of them. But if you were to pick three key drivers behind the trend, what would you say they were?
So I know we've talked about a couple of these things before. I would say the first thing is the illusion that permanent work offered job stability and security was broken by the 2008 financial crash. And because of the way in which so many people were made redundant in a way that was more public because of the internet than had ever been made visible in previous times, I think the downturn then did an awful lot to undermine the psychological contract that might once have underpinned the employee-employer relationship. And since that time, the illusion that working as an employee is the most preferred employment type has probably been usurped by the illusion that self-employment is a more desirable way of life because it denotes flexibility and freedom and autonomy and the idea that you're in charge of your destiny, you get variety, you get to work when you want, from where you want, and all the lifestyle factors that can be tied to self-employment. Personally, and I'm sure you and I could have another fascinating conversation about this, but I'm not of the view that self-employment is the panacea. I think it's jolly hard work, and I don't think, I think very few and far between are the individuals that manage to make a seismic financial success of things. I think if you look at the data, actually the average wage of a self-employed person is in the lower income tax threshold.
Yeah.
So you asked me for three things. I think self-employment is no longer considered risky in the way that it once was. You
Yeah.
or I, with our grey hair, might agree to disagree on that point, but there is an illusion that self-employment is empowering, let's say. And I think, you know, the final point that drives this trend is that employers, whether they are aware of it or not, every interaction with the labour market reshapes the labour market. So when employers demand access to labour without offering any semblance of job security in return, they tacitly erode the expectation of job security.
Mm.
So that's it, isn't it, in a nutshell? If you don't believe that job security is available, you will cease to look for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the whole deal between employer and employee has shifted quite markedly, hasn't it, over the last decade or two?
Yeah, and also, you know, we did some analysis for a client last month to look at the full spectrum of employment types, and we came up with 14 different
Wow.
employment types for that exercise.
Wow. That's fascinating. One question that has just popped into my head. What role do you think technology is playing in the evolution of talent ecosystems?
Well, technology itself can be construed to be a method of getting work done. If you look
Mm.
to next generation artificial intelligence or process automation or robotic process automation, you know, technology is slowly eroding and replacing tasks that were previously done by human hands. So when we look at the full spectrum of, in fact, I made a mistake when I said before 14 different employment types. That's not what I meant. 14 different ways in which you can get work done. Technology is one of those parts.
Yeah.
So and you know, if we work on the basis that next generation technology is only going to become increasingly powerful and potent, then we can follow the hypothesis that more and more aspects of work previously undertaken by humans will in the future be undertaken by technology. It again reshapes the psychological contract. You might argue, well, we won't be working 40-hour work weeks. I think that's very, very, very likely. We will be working 40-hour work weeks. I don't think it's as simplistic as reducing down to a 4-day work week, because that to me seems too dogged and regimented, and it doesn't seem to factor in the needs of an organization's full spectrum of stakeholders.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, technology is eroding certain tasks. And I think, you know, while we can say with a degree of confidence, oh yes, but technology will also create roles that haven't been invented yet, there is still a gap, isn't there, between erosion and identification of what these new roles and functions might be.
There's another whole podcast series on that as well, I think, which I find fascinating. Every time we have one of these conversations, you know, the kind of the interconnectedness of not only what we talk about, but kind of what we don't talk about as well, just completely fascinates me. So, you know, if we start to look into the future, 2030 and beyond, in the context of next generation talent ecosystems, give me what you think might be an optimistic outcome and what might be a pessimistic outcome in the way that they evolve.
So optimistically, and this is something that we're trying to do at Working the Future, optimistically, I absolutely believe there is it's not difficult to build your own talent ecosystem for your organization. It involves some comprehensive strategic workforce planning, so identifying the broadest brushstrokes of the competencies that you think you will need down the line in order to both survive and thrive as a business. And I think it requires some analysis of whether or not you think you will be able to offer permanent employment contracts, or whether you would be better off offering more on-demand employment contracts, but nurturing the relationship with the individual, whoever they are, whatever contract they're on. I think that's entirely plausible. I think we have really short memories in our collective recollection of how work works, and we overlook, for instance, as you know, Steve, I was very involved with the mobile telecommunications industry in the 1990s. There were no mobile phones. There were no commercially available mobile phones before the very late 1980s. And we absolutely overlook the fact that the mobile networks upon which we rely today for 24/7, 365 high-speed data connectivity didn't exist 30 years ago. But all of those networks were built by contract staff, because we couldn't have met the commercial obligations to build out a network had we waited around to find permanent staff. And those permanent staff with their skill sets didn't exist in that time. So we deployed teams of people with the most aligned skill sets to design and build those networks. And they mostly came from the military and from the electrician trade. And as the mobile networks built out slowly but surely, more people joined the industry. But we didn't have the competencies, we didn't have the know-how at the beginning of that cycle. So we made do with what we had, and we still got the job done.
Yeah. So as an optimistic scenario for 2030, I guess what you're saying there is that we can develop the ecosystem in parallel with any sort of major, I mean, the example you cited there was infrastructure investment, to create something that we subsequently all rely on heavily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you take an innovative approach to these things, you can achieve all kinds of things. And actually, the late David Graeber wrote I think one of his last books that he wrote was called Bullshit Jobs, about all the jobs that people do that just serve no purpose. And arguably, you could look at that and say, well, why are we hiring people on a full-time permanent basis to do jobs that don't actually need doing, and so on? Why don't we become more lean, efficient, and agile? And by the way, organizational agility will rely on the alternative workforce and these full spectrum talent ecosystems to maintain that dexterity and that ability to shapeshift and evolve. So optimistic scenario is that organizations get with a program and start investing in the development of talent ecosystems, regardless of whether they end up hiring these people. It's good practice to develop relationships with people that might work with you in the future. And there is a little bit of localism around that as well, I would say, which isn't a bad thing given the planetary constraints that we're up against. Worst case, total failure to adapt, total collapse. I can't say it more plainly than that. If you do not adapt your organization in the way that is required to meet and successfully navigate the intersection of these trends that we've been talking about on this podcast, I don't think your long-range prospects look good.
And that's a really nice segue, I think, into the final question, which is about the actions that organizations can take now, given this insight, to ready themselves for this rapidly evolving future.
Right, 100%. So the very, very first thing I think we have to do is to stop thinking about organizational headcount as a viable metric of growth, right? Because traditionally, if you look at the Scale Up Institute, actually, one of the things that they had noted was increased turnover and increased headcount were measures of scale up. Well, headcount isn't going to be a measure of scale up, is it? Or a measure of growth. I think we need to, again, stop thinking in monochrome and thinking about what the organization wants and needs, and start getting curious to find out what talent is available in your local community and on what basis, and then start working out whether or not you could viably engage with people on a wider range of employment contracts to deliver work outcomes for you. But that does demand getting curious and kickstarting conversations with great questions about who's out there, what value could they offer us, what could that look like, how could that work. It means that we've got to start thinking more laterally than we've been thinking in the last 30, 40 years, with these blinkers on, thinking that everything that we construct in a work context has to exist in a very siloed, fragmented way. Employers need to find new ways to attract, motivate, engage, and retain workers to allow and enable optimal organizational agility. So you might roll somebody onto a project for a fixed period of time, roll them off. You're not paying for them when they're not there, but you bring them back in the next time you've got an uptick of activity that they could add value to. So I think we've got to stop thinking actually about employee experience, employee engagement, and we've got to start thinking about who the people are and using a different language. So the language that we're introducing is we're swapping out employee with and replacing it with internal stakeholder,
Right.
which is a far more inclusive framing of language. And it immediately invites anybody that hears the term or uses the term to start thinking more holistically about the full range of employment types available.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think the other thing that did particularly strike me that sort of encompasses a lot of what you've said is this idea of nurturing relationships in a talent ecosystem, which I think plays nicely into what you were just describing, and as a shift from employee through to, you know, a much broader term, an internal stakeholder. It just feels it fits quite nicely there.
Yeah, and it plays with something that you brought up previously, which is we have to rehumanize our workplaces. We've got to stop thinking about human capital as some commoditized box that can be moved from project A to project B, because that is not true of the or representative of the economies that we're now working within. You know, knowledge workers, people that put forward their know-how and acumen, need certain psychological conditions to be met in order to deliver their best. We need all hands on deck. We need optimal creativity and brainstorming if we're going to navigate the complexity of what lies beyond the next hour. So we need to be harnessing all the gifts, all the talents, and we can only do that when we rehumanize and place relationship at the heart of everything.
I think that's a beautiful way to leave this episode as well, the rehumanizing of the workplace. Kat, thank you so much. That's been absolutely brilliant once again. And in the podcast description, you'll be able to find a link to the Working the Future website and also how you can get in touch with Kat to find out more about what Working the Future does and how they do it. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. Do subscribe so you never miss another episode, and let your friends and colleagues know all about the Informing Choices mini pod. I'll see you on another episode very soon.